Sam,
Hello, sir.
how much do you think you could get done in 100 days?
Well, if we're going by our track record, about 6 podcasts.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we look at protests and revolutions past and present and try to see if we can tease out any lessons for us in the current day. My name is Adam, and with me, as always, is a man who is once again on the complete opposite side of the country from where we're talking about. Sam, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. And you are also doing well because you had a nice holiday in between the last time we spoke, which is why this podcast is coming out a bit later than normal.
Yeah, this podcast is out slightly late because I was on vacation. I was in Georgia. Fascinating place. We should probably do an episode about that. We were talking about it a little bit off air, but one of the things that I didn't mention was the exhibit that I went to about the Soviet occupation of Georgia. And that was fascinating. Georgia, very, very pro-EU, very, very pro-NATO. They do not like Russia. That is completely understandable because Russia occupies 2 areas of their country to this day, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Although a lot of trade with Russia does still happen, and they currently have a very pro-Russian government, but the people are very anti-Russia. And they had an exhibit on at the National Gallery about the Soviet occupation. And I went there with a Russian. One of my friends was Russian.
Okay.
We were sort of looking at this exhibit, getting her take on it, and she said, "Yeah, you know, this is good. It's interesting, but it sort of presents it like the Bolsheviks in the 20s had this sort of grand master plan, but really they were just a bunch of like gangsters and cowboys who were winging it." Like sort of,
Yeah, much like
every military operation was poorly thought out. They had no plan. They were just going for it.
I mean, that's realistically every revolution, right?
Oh yeah.
And if the listeners haven't caught on by now, we're not talking about Georgia, the state in the United States.
Oh yeah.
We are talking about better Georgia, dare I say, in the Caucasus region of the world.
Barring Atlanta Airport, I've never been to Georgia, the state, so I can't compare.
Same. I've only been to Atlanta Airport. And fun fact, someone did a video about which toilet in the world is probably the most used toilet in the world, and it was one in Atlanta Airport.
Really?
They did the math.
I need to find that video. That's fascinating and disgusting.
But I'm glad you enjoyed your holiday to Georgia. I've not been to any former Soviet countries, but I would love to go to all of them, basically, to see one day and to see what the aftermath has been. And Georgia, one of those that it seems enjoy being out of the Soviet Union, but that cannot be said for most of the countries, I believe. But
well, yeah, I mean They are not a fan of the Soviet Union there for sure, but it's more of the point that they're not a fan of Russia. They were a part of the Russian Empire before that, and then part of the Soviet Empire. Stalin was not good to the Georgian people.
he was Georgian.
He was Georgian, yes, that's noteworthy, but he was not good to the Georgian people, and so I think he in particular was considered a big insult. But they rolled out, the various healthcare infrastructures and educational infrastructures and housing infrastructures and such like that. But I do think the people of Georgia would not reflect positively on their time in the Soviet Union.
And last note on Georgia, I believe it's one of the oldest Christian nations in the world, right?
Yep, 3rd oldest Christian nation behind Armenia and Ethiopia.
Yeah.
And I saw the grave of Saint Nino, who brought Christianity to the country. And actually, while I was there, about like a week before I arrived, the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church died. And so the sort of conclave, I guess, was happening in Tbilisi.
Wow.
But in Georgia, the church and the state are quite intertwined. So it's a very political event.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on while I was there.
Sounds like a great trip. I can't wait to hear more about it one day. Maybe our listeners can too.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that the insight you learned will seep its way into future podcasts, and we'll hear a lot of separate stories here and there.
Yes, possibly so. Travel is wonderful for expanding the mind.
And speaking of communism, no, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, speaking of communism is great. I was going to say that one of the things that happened whilst I was in Georgia is that the mayor of New York City and the mayor of our hearts, Zohran Mamdani, passed 100 days in office. We said when we covered his election that we were going to do a 100 days episode. We're currently at 116, slightly late because I was on holiday. Apologies for that. But we're gonna have a chat about the things that he has accomplished in that time and what that might say about his sort of style of governance, what other leaders might want to draw out from that, what we as voters, as communitarians, as organizers potentially might draw out from this period. Sound good?
Sounds great. I think the American voters have learned a lot in this time, and I'm looking forward to getting into it.
Well, I wanted to start out actually by asking, because I'm obviously living in Europe and we get headlines about Mamdani. I pay more attention than perhaps the average European to what goes on in American politics, especially, a regional as New York City is. It's an important city, but it is still just one city. So what is the vibe? And you're not particularly close to New York City either.
Not at all.
So what is the vibe? What have you heard on the airwaves from people out and about in the States about Zohran Mamdani during the first 4 months of his mayoralty?
Well, I think you're right in that I'm not close, because I think distance-wise, we're almost the same distance from New York City. Mileage
true, actually, yeah.
As the crow flies.
I think that's true.
But genuinely very positive things, even more positive things now than during the election. And I'm in my own bubble of political persuasion, but online, even when it is something very neutral like BBC News or the New York Times reporting on him, most of the comments I see are very positive. There's a meme where it's like, that's my mayor, and then in brackets it's like, I'm from St. Louis or I'm from California or wherever. And
I've seen it with Switzerland. It's
yeah, I don't even know if any Swiss people can name their politicians genuinely.
Alain Berset, that's the one I got. That's
nice. But then when I talk to people offline, the vibe very much seems to be that he's a guy getting stuff done, and they can respect that even if they didn't support him in his run up to being mayor. And he's still, kind of the talk of the country in terms of, like, the New York City mayor was not a focal point ever really nationally until this, maybe like right after 9/11. That was a moment for Rudy Giuliani. But other than that, people don't really talk about the mayor of cities, but people can't seem to stop talking about whether it's good or bad, though there hasn't really been a lot of bad to say. And I think that's important to point out, because a lot of the people on the left that helped get him elected said, we will still be critical if he wins, right? We have to hold him accountable. And I think Mamdani expected that. And we're trying to be as harsh as we can, I think, on the left, but he is doing a lot. He's working very hard, and 100 days in, when he's at his press conferences, he looks very tired.
Yeah.
Which I think might say something to his work ethic and what he's trying to implement.
I think so too. And I'm glad you brought up the criticisms, because we will come to that. And they are fairly thin, I think, even for attacks on leftists. But let's start out. We're going to basically follow his sort of address. He gave this big speech for his 100 days, and some people spoke before. Bernie Sanders made a cameo.
Surprise cameo, right?
Surprise cameo. It was framed as a surprise cameo. I'm slightly skeptical of that.
It was a surprise for the crowd. That's what I mean.
Yes, for sure. It was a surprise for the crowd, absolutely. And it was presented as though it was a surprise for Zohran Mamdani. No. As I say, I'm skeptical, but yeah. Doesn't matter either way, really. But if you go on to Zohran's website, the Mayor of New York's website, there are 4 headline figures that he has sort of posted there, or his team have posted there. And that is $1.2 billion secured for universal childcare. It's $9.3 million secured in restitution for workers and small businesses. It's $34 million won on behalf of tenants, and it is 100,000 potholes fixed in New York. So that is kind of how he goes through his speech as well. He begins by talking about how he was elected as a democratic socialist and intends to govern as such. And this is something that I thought was very interesting, which is that he keeps hammering home the message that he is going to govern from a socialist perspective. And he even acknowledges that, in the United States, socialism is often thought of as a dirty word, but that he doesn't sort of think of it in that way. Do you think that is changing, socialism being a dirty word in the United States?
Well, if anyone's tuned in to the TikTok lives from our account where I'm talking to viewers, it's changed in some circles, but in the centrist to conservative wings, it's still thrown around as a dirty word, but to no effect, because at this point, most of the left-wing people in the United States, not politicians, but people that you meet, don't have any negative view towards socialism, especially young people. And do you have the Bernie quote from the speech when he came up for the 100 days?
I don't have Bernie's quote now.
So Bernie said something to the effect of, over the years, I have been on stage with, I don't know if he said hundreds or thousands of politicians that I support, and there's only one that will openly call himself a democratic socialist, and it's this guy right here, and it was Zohran. And he was just saying how proud he was of that fact. And in a way, like, I do think this has rejuvenated Bernie Sanders in that after the second Trump election, or the second time Trump getting elected, he just looked tired. Like, all this work for naught. The Democratic Party is never going to change. What hope left is there for his platform he stands on, right? He's getting very old, up there in age. He's like 84, I think.
Yeah, he's an old guy now.
And this campaign with Zohran has really, really rejuvenated his spirit, it seems like, because you can see the fruits of his direct movement that's happened in the past, 15 or so years coming to fruition. And I'm really happy for Bernie on that front.
Yeah, he paved the way, perhaps, in the United States at least.
Well, Mamdani did say the first time he ever was political was when he was canvassing for Bernie Sanders in 15?
Yeah, and that's interesting because I believe Zohran is to the left of Sanders, who would be considered a fairly center-left politician in Europe.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that demonstrates the progression, right? You have like AOC, who's more or less where Bernie is. But then you have Mamdani, who is more progressive.
Yeah. So Bernie comes on stage a little bit later in Mamdani's speech. And in addition to saying how he was elected as a democratic socialist, he spends a bit of time highlighting some of the key figures from his first 100 days in office. And it was impressive. As is typical for Mamdani's style, he was just on it with being on message. He was like, we did this, we did this, we did this, we did this, we did this. Starts out by talking about what is perhaps his biggest win, which was the promise of universal childcare. And he says, right at the beginning of the speech, he said, I began my campaign with the promise of universal childcare, and in 8 days we delivered it. Now, what that means in practice is he's secured funds by communications with Kathy Hochul, who is governor of New York State, I believe.
Yeah, quite centrist in policies.
Well, he nevertheless has secured $1.2 billion in funding, largely not only because of his own sort of charisma and margin of victory, but the huge sort of grassroots supporting campaign that he had behind him. And this means that this year, there are going to be 8,000 places made available for children in New York, 12,000 next year, and by the end of his term, every 2-year-old in New York City will have childcare available to them. I'm not entirely sure how long that lasts. He said 2-year-old in his speech. And this equates to, for families with young children, an average saving of $20,000 per child per year.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge amount of money that he's returning to his constituents.
And to Europeans listening, that might sound like a shocking amount of money for childcare, but that's actually less than some people pay.
It's expensive in Europe too. It's like my colleague who had it in Amsterdam, and this is Amsterdam, which is thought of as a fairly progressive place, which nevertheless has some pretty conservative policies in many ways. She was married and they had a 3-year-old, and her entire salary went for childcare for the 3-year-old, pretty much, like almost all of it.
But that just goes to show, like, the West right now and the status of childcare is that people are quitting their jobs because literally all of their salary would go to childcare, which I think is the point of socialist policy in general, is to say that that's not acceptable.
Yeah, for sure. And I suppose that's one of the things that Mamdani is trying to rectify. It'll be good for the economy, get more people into work, make families more secure, etc. And speaking of making families more secure, he focused on housing a lot as well. Won $34 million for tenants in New York. They ordered 6,070 apartment improvements. They issued 190,000 violation orders to landlords, 190,000 in 100 days.
Busy office.
Busy office. He started an office actually right when they got started. That was on January 4th. He appointed a watchdog at the housing department, and that watchdog filed 190,000 violations.
And I don't have the number in front of me, but there was over 100,000 applications to work for Zohran's government.
Yeah.
Like, the young people really want to be involved in this thing. And I saw a video of a guy stopping Mayor Mamdani on the street to give him his resume, and he said, I'll have a look at it and I'll get back to you. And I genuinely believe Mamdani when he says that, you know?
Yeah, I'm sure, or someone will.
At the very least, because he's like, this is a great photo op, you know?
Well, that's the thing, and something we'll come to in a little bit. He is very, very media savvy. You know, that's one of his big skills. He talked about, after the housing, that they're going to build thousands of new units. Didn't say at how many, but thousands. Appointed a board to look at reducing rents. He hammered home again at this point that though the workers should not be afraid, those who go after workers should be afraid. Then he moved on to workers, joining the picket line with nurses. He returned $9.3 million to various workers, helped protect time off for 4 million workers, got 10,000 wrongly terminated delivery drivers reinstated, which I hadn't heard about, but that was like a pretty big success. And 60,000 cautions were issued to employers. He basically made hidden fees in like gym memberships and banks illegal. So that's much harder to do. He's talked about the economy in more of a Wall Street sense very briefly, pointed out that VC funding is its highest rate for 5 years and that employment is high in the city. He talked about how the murder rate is at record lows, crime's down. He very briefly mentioned the NYPD. He said the NYPD has helped take 1,000 guns off the street since January 1st. And then he very quickly pivoted into saying how they were opening a new office of community safety to look at other methods of reducing crime in the city, focusing on mental health and social support and something like that. Now, to the trained ear, that sounds very deliberate, but would you like to sort of elaborate on maybe what he's done there in a media literacy sense?
I mean, it seems like he's throwing both sides of bone there. And when he was talking about crime statistics, I noticed that he did actually incorporate like the latter half of last year into them. So I don't think he actually played
it's 180 days, these statistics. Yeah.
So I think that's just doing what other politicians kind of do, which is piggybacking off anything they can take from a predecessor. But I think he's throwing a bone there to the police commissioner and, you know, all of Staten Island who are very oorah about the police. It's acknowledging that they still exist as an important part of the community. Yeah. Everyone talked about his opponents talked about how it would be lawless if he was elected and how he wanted to abolish the police. So I think it's just acknowledging that that's not what's going on. But the community safety aspect was a promise in the campaign. So I think that he's pivoting into a promise that goes hand in hand with police work.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned Staten Island because he specifically said that no one's been murdered in Staten Island for X number of days, whatever.
Like 300 days or something. I'm like, that's not how long you've been mayor.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It was longer than he had been the mayor.
Yeah,
but, he is a politician. So,
well, as Eric Adams would say, Staten Island is the New York City of the boroughs or something.
Oh yeah, the newest Albanian, Eric Adams.
I'm sure there have been Albanian children born since then, but yeah, the newest convert.
Newest naturalized Albanian.
So it turns out he meant it when he said Tirana is the New York City of Albania, and he didn't mean the other ones, right?
Yeah, exactly. Until such time as he gets citizenships of every other country. Now, after he talked about safety, he talked very briefly about the budget. And he did a very interesting rhetorical kind of flourish here, where he started out with the Margaret Thatcher quote.
Oh, yeah.
And Margaret Thatcher, well, famously said a lot of things, but one of them was the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. And Mamdani quoted this and said, well, now I say to her that you can let the problems pile up and eventually you'll need a socialist to come and clean up the mess. Big cheers there. Lots and lots of big cheers. However, I thought that this might be an interesting moment to talk about one of the criticisms of Mamdani. And as established, these criticisms are fairly weak, but I want to get your take on it.
Okay.
Which is the budget shortfall in the New York City budget. When he entered the office, there was a $7 billion deficit in the budget that he had to fill through various sort of measures, cuts to corporate contracts like McKinsey and various other sort of private sector partnerships that he's eliminating. That has reduced the deficit to 5.3 billion, but that reduction, that sort of 2 billion reduction, is sort of theoretical at this point because not all of those contracts have played out yet. So it's like if all goes well, they've done the maths to make it 5 billion, but it hasn't actually happened yet. And the question of how he's going to raise this sort of $5 billion that he needs is something that his opponents are critical of. And probably the most valid of the criticisms against him that I've seen. There are others, but that is probably the most sort of material criticism, I think.
Yeah, I'm guessing we're not going to talk about the Sharia law criticisms, right?
Nah. Well, I guess so. His opponent said he was going to do Sharia law, and I guess if that's what he's doing, fine. Looks chill to me.
Woke Sharia.
Well, it is taking on I will pivot off of that for a moment because are you familiar with Islamo-Gauchism?
No.
So this is like a trick from the French far right that is kind of pan-European now, but it's a French idea where Islam and the left are linked in the right's imagination and they call it Islamo-Gauchism. And they're like, the left and the Muslims are going to team up on us and we're all going to have mandatory Sharia trans conversion, and like that's sort of their opinion. But you really have seen the emergence of a European style racism with Mamdani being the mayor of New York.
It's because it's the only time a Muslim in America has even gotten close to any sort of power. You even had, like, they were throwing this around with Obama, and they were just calling him a Muslim as an insult.
Well, his middle name is Hussein, so
yeah. I've always noticed that racism, like blatant racism in America, comes from a very like stereotypically ignorant place. Like if you think of the KKK and like the South and like an anti-intellectual place. Whereas like European racism comes from a pseudo-academic place of like the Darwinistic approach to racism from the 1800s that is somehow being revived by the far right now, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, the opponents of Mamdani are going to the only sources they have for that type of racism, which is Europe against Muslims. So maybe that's why we're seeing it now. Anyway, what was the original question?
Budget.
Budget.
Yeah.
Budget. Yeah, the budget thing, I mean, it's kind of wild because I've lived in the world for 30 years now, and I've kind of never known a United States that has a surplus of anything. Like every year, from the federal government and their debt to like my local cities, we're always operating from a deficit, which is scary because the stock market continues to go up and the military budget continues to go up. So like, why do we just keep operating everything else on a deficit? You know, there's never enough money for schools, never enough money for hospitals. Anyway, I think with this situation, like any mayor elected, whoever it was, would have inherited this deficit. So I don't think having the deficit is a criticism. And I think people criticizing Mamdani are basically saying, why is he trying to implement programs that cost money when we need to be saving money, right? That's the criticism. Did you see, I know this didn't put a huge dent in that deficit, but it'll do something, which was a few days after the 100 days on tax day, which is April 15th, he announced a specific tax. Did you see what this was?
I didn't know.
So this was, you might want to look up exactly what it's called, but I know a lot of people in London would love this, where homes above like $5 million that are not the primary occupancy of someone will be taxed to a large amount.
Oh, that's great. People in London would love that. That's awesome.
Yeah. And coincidentally, Trump kind of turned on Mamdani after this was announced. As you know, he has many properties in New York City that are unoccupied. But he did this basically to raise money to chip into that deficit and fulfill a promise of taxing the rich. And to me, it was just insane how somehow there were still everyday working people that had something to say about this that was negative. And I don't know why.
So it's being called the pied-à-terre tax, announced by Mamdani and Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York. It's projected to bring in $500 million annually. A tax on second homes worth over $5 million. So an eminently reasonable tax that won't affect anyone who isn't extraordinarily wealthy already.
Exactly.
That will bring in $500 million a year. That's cool. I hadn't heard about that one.
He did a very media savvy announcement to it. It was on tax day. He did like a little knock on the pane like of the TikTok video, and he's like, hey, remember when we said we'd tax the rich? Well, here we are. And he pointed to like a specific apartment owned by a very specific rich guy who I don't remember exactly who it was. But
interesting. Okay.
He was like, this guy's apartment costs $32 million and we're going to raise the tax on it. And he doesn't live here.
Now that is interesting. The article that I've pulled up about it is saying that Ken Griffin, who is the CEO of Citadel, suggests that $6 billion NYC project may be at risk over Mamdani tax, which in addition to being, let's face it, incorrect because the infrastructure is where it is literally just a rich guy holding a gun to to the head of the mayor of New York. So that's a cool tax that I hadn't heard about. But Mamdani's approach to fixing this deficit has always been to raise additional taxes. The best faith interpretation of the criticism for that is that he can't raise those taxes by himself necessarily. He needs the cooperation of Albany. But for now, he has that. So that's
And I mentioned that Hochul was a centrist earlier, and I believe the reason he has her support on so many items is because he's so popular, right? And he can do... Well, I think we talked about this in our episode about him when he was running, which is that can he achieve what he wants? And it's either yes or no because of other people standing in his way. And as long as he maintains the good faith of his supporters, he can just say, hey, I want to do this, but these people won't allow it. So vote them out, petition them, that type of stuff. And I think like he won't be able to achieve everything, but as long as he is operating in good faith, then he can still maintain the goodwill of his supporters and New York City in general.
Hi everyone, Adam here with a little update that occurred between the recording and the release of this episode. Last week, I believe on the 28th of April, Mamdani gave a press conference with Council Speaker Julie Menin, who have been pretty at odds about how to close the budget gap in New York, and they agreed that they would raise $1 billion to close the budget deficit by reworking a tax credit that largely benefits the rich. The specifics of this tax credit are fairly complicated, but basically there is a mechanism in American tax law whereby you can subtract your state taxes from federal taxes paid. A little while ago, the federal government, I believe in 2019, put a cap on the amount you could reduce. And so there are 30 states, New York State included, that allow you to sort of bypass this cap on the amount you can subtract from your federal taxes by creating a business entity and sort of combining your personal and business income through that. This disproportionately benefits rich people. And Mamdani's proposed cut basically means that instead of 100% tax credit on income through this mechanism, that is reduced to 75%, and that is expected to raise $1 billion, further helping to close the budget shortfall. Hochul and indeed Menon had been very, very resistant to anything like this, but this has shown that with enough popular support and policies that are progressive and designed to provide public services, we can put enough pressure on public officials to implement them. And I think this is a very hopeful step for the people of New York City. Yeah, I think so. The other idea that I've seen floated for how he might reduce the budget deficit, which I don't think would put a huge dent in the amount of money they need actually, but would be a change and possibly bring other positive benefits to New York, is eliminating free parking. Apparently 97% of street parking in New York is free, or like outside of houses is free, which is like unheard of in any other American city. A huge amount of it is, and so the talks of scrapping that and using the fees to fund these various projects, which I think might also be why he's focusing on buses so much.
Maybe, but so I lived in Hong Kong, right? And I think a big difference between New York City and Hong Kong is still the surprising amount of people that do own cars in New York City, and thus why the streets are so wide compared to some other cities of its size and density. But as someone that lived there and now lives in San Diego, let me tell you a short anecdote about what our mayor just did, which our mayor, Todd Gloria, is terrible. But I took you to Balboa Park in San Diego when you came to visit, and it's always had free parking. It's one of the few third spaces we have in this city, right? We have the beaches and we have Balboa Park. Those are like the free areas you can congregate. And overnight, they implemented paid parking there for the first time in over 100 years.
Oh, wow.
And this is not a city where most people live around it. It's not like Central Park in New York City. There's not any trolley system that goes through there. There's like one bus. So essentially everyone will be paying to park there. Museum attendance has gone down by 40% this year.
Wow.
And even the volunteers at the zoo and at the museums has gone down a lot because people can't afford to pay it. And it's a private company that they have sold the rights to parking to. That's how it kind of works in the US. And even if the city maintains control in New York City, it's going to be a very bad move for Mamdani's popularity, I would say, if he implemented paid parking. That's a very like touchy subject in America. And then the worst case scenario for paid parking is what happened in Chicago. I don't know if you know about Chicago's parking system.
All privatized, right?
It's privatized, and it has been sold to Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
And anytime there needs to be any construction that will affect parking, they have to get approval from the city-state, basically, of Abu Dhabi in Chicago. So, like, that's a worst-case scenario of what can happen to your city streets, where you basically lose control of what can happen on them. Because I can't imagine they change the parking in New York City, and, like, through Mamdani's tenure, city maintains control of it. But I can't imagine, like, let's say in the 20 years, there's another huge deficit. It would be very tempting to sell that off and just catch up to make a surplus, right? That's why other cities have done this. So I'm skeptical about that plan just based on like previous experience with American parking.
Well, to be fair, that isn't a plan that he's announced. It was a rumor that I saw.
No. And that's just my thoughts on like that in general, not anything about Mamdani. But it's a tricky situation. Americans in their cars. taking that
sure.
into account, especially when like someone would have to pay to live or like get a part of their apartment packages, they have to pay for parking now. It's tricky.
So after sort of not talking about the budget and just and very deftly inserting this rhetorical device about Margaret Thatcher, Zohran then stresses that he wants the city to be for working people. He describes a little pastiche of New York life where children are playing and there's faster buses and childcare centers are opening and there's bike lanes going down the boulevard and talking about building more bike lanes is specifically in time for the World Cup. And he starts talking about socialism and how he describes that the role of the government is to fight for the many, not for the few, to fight for affordability, for immigrants, for mental health clinics, for trans rights. Mamdani describes government as a series of choices, and he describes socialism as the choice to fight for every New Yorker. This is his most rhetorically powerful part of the speech, I think. He then starts talking about Milwaukee and the success of a socialist mayor in Milwaukee in the 1920s and how the best park system was built in Milwaukee, how they weathered the Great Depression better than basically anywhere else in the country. The mayor who was elected in Milwaukee was called Victor Berger, and his style of governance was described as sewer socialism. And as a result, Mamdani described what he's doing as pothole politics, the 2026 answer to sewer socialism. And the idea behind pothole politics is that no task is too small, government is not too big, too busy, or too mired in paperwork to fix the problems. And then he talked to his opponents and said, to the cynics, we're going to fill your potholes too. Now, this part of his speech was very rhetorically powerful. It did feel like something that was designed by a marketing team, but I think it is effective in its messaging. Like, he's got this little snappy slogan, pothole politics, that he can bust out whenever he needs to describe the kind of work that he's doing and the very visible kind of work that he's doing. For example, filling in 100,000 potholes. He himself and various news articles were keen to point out that 100,000 potholes is the most amount of potholes that have been filled in by a mayor in the first 100 days in 11 years. I couldn't find, and I did look, but I couldn't find the most ever filled in the first 100 days. But it's been a particularly snowy winter in New York. There were 2 big snowstorms, and that resulted in more potholes in the winter. So they filled in 100,000. And he did it in a very interesting way as well. He did it in these blitzes where you'd have like one day where you'd have hundreds of teams out, and so lots and lots would get filled in one day. And that too was a very visible way of doing this work that he was doing.
Yeah.
And he basically argued that you could use government to build better politics through talking about pothole politics like that. Do you think that's a winning strategy?
I think it's very important to, in this situation, with as many eyes that are on you and as many critics as you have, both in the Democrat and Republican Party, to highlight your wins and potholes and all these photo ops and things are very definitive ways to do that, because there will come a time where, like in every sort of tenure as a mayor or a senator or as a president, there's going to be low points and people are going to jump on those low points for sure. So I think when you tally up your wins, you can use them as basically favors for good faith when things do get tough. It does feel like maybe disingenuous to some of his critics. So, why is he announcing little thing he does? Well, it's because you're going to announce every single thing that goes wrong, right? So I think he's treating this sort of as a never-ending campaign, right? He's keeping the people in the loop, which is not something that mayors typically do.
I think that leads us nicely to a point of criticism that I wanted to touch on and a retort to it as well, which is some of his critics, there's a New York Post article, dreadful rag, but quoting council member Joanne Ariola from Queens, who's a Republican, and she said about this speech specifically, the article was sort of accusing him of being a sort of Instagram politician, doing it for the real rather than any actual material stuff. And she said, the mayor tried hard to paint a positive picture, but every day New Yorkers aren't seeing any real changes. What we're seeing are machete attacks on the subway, bombs at Gracie Mansion, a deterioration of public safety. He's focusing so much on his hollow socialist campaign promises and forgetting that most people just want to get to and from work without worrying about a machete in their back.
Dreadful rag indeed.
Yeah. I think that we have seen real things that he's put into place, or at least things that, well, some real things that have been put in place, some real things that are coming, in theory, the childcare. And I think it's something that other politicians could learn from. I was thinking in response about the Labour Party in the UK that's been in government for like 2 years now, nearly, one and a half. And they have very, very unpopular Labour in the UK. They're hemorrhaging votes to the right to the Reform Party and hemorrhaging votes to the left from the Green Party. And yet they've done some very similar things. Like they instituted 33 hours per week of childcare for children aged 9 months to 4 years. Very little fanfare about that. If you don't have a kid that age, you're unlikely to know. They've put in measures to penalize water companies. They've improved access to renewable power. They've started the process of nationalizing the railways. They've banned no-fault evictions starting on May 1st. The tenancy laws are being much, much stronger for tenants in the UK. And they haven't talked about it at all. And that's part of why everyone thinks they're doing so rubbish. Not that I'm defending Starmer's government. I do think they are rubbish, but they could be making a much bigger fanfare of the things they're doing than they are, and they aren't. And I think that's to their detriment strategically.
Yeah.
So the speech is sort of nearly over at this point. He ends it with 3 big announcements. One is talking about his citywide grocery store plan, a government-run grocery store in every borough. This is when he talks about, this is when he says, I wish Bernie Sanders could be here, and he appears on stage. Bernie talks about the importance of diet, and he congratulates Zohran, and it's all a very sort of pleasant moment. Zohran has a pretty cool line about this where he says, and to my detractors who say that government grocery stores can't work, I say I look forward to the competition.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice.
Which I thought was a pretty good way of of turning the tables. You know, left is often accused of being anti-business, and he's like, well, if we're so anti-business, beat us in the marketplace, and we'll see, which I think was pretty cool. He then talks about how he's got plans to cut commutes by 6 minutes each way, which, you know, isn't a huge margin, but does feel achievable through rapid bus routes, more accessible bus stops, and other infrastructure stuff. And then he talks about trash containerization, how they're going to put trash in containers.
I was going to bring this up because this actually has started rolling out. And
yeah,
it feels very weird that up until 2026, New York City didn't have trash cans.
Yeah, so I looked into this a little bit. First of all, I mean, this was another great marketing bit where he does the POV "you're a rat," and it's one of the few like POV videos that is actually filmed from a rat's POV. It's like down on the ground. It was like very well done, and I was a big fan of that one detail. Yeah. But no, so New York did have containerized trash in the past, but basically all the garbage juice pooled in the bottom of the containers and it was disgusting, and the rats lived in there anyway. And then they switched to bags out on the street, and part of why it didn't change is that trash collection was like the last thing in New York to still be controlled by the mob.
Okay.
The mob controlled it for a really, really long time in New York, and so changing it back was hard. So the idea is that now these big trash cans are better designed, and it's going to be harder for rats to sort of make their homes in these dumpsters. Is the idea? We'll see how it works out.
Welcome to 1986, New York City. We're proud of you. It is just weird to picture like the capital of the world, as a lot of people fancy New York City as being.
Yeah.
With just piles of rubbish on every street, like literally. And then it's like, oh man, look at this third world country. It's like, no, this is the design. You just put the trash on the street. It's fine. So he concludes his speech by talking about affordability and how he's going to make everything a bit more affordable for everyone else. And that's about where we'll wrap up to. He hit some big highlights, got the ball rolling on a lot of things, and seems to be doing fairly well materially in his first 100 days. Sam,
you grade papers for a living. What grade would you give Zohran Mamdani?
I'd give him an A. Easy. Like, he talked a big game in his campaign, and he seems to be following through in all the ways he can. And it kind of goes to show in that, much to the chagrin of the mainstream Democrats, he's doing very well, and he's still very popular. And I think this raises a question to a lot of, well, all the other politicians of the United States, is if he can do this in 100 days, why can't you do it in 4 years, right? Why can't you do it in a year? It kind of exposes the lack of drive that many politicians, especially in the Democratic Party, right, have when they talk a big game of progressivism, but then don't deliver. And yeah, I'd give him an A, easily. How about you?
I'd give him an A minus.
Okay.
But just for some political flourishes, I think he's done well. I think that some of the things that he's claiming exaggerated to look good in a speech, but you know, he is still a politician working on the stage that he's working on. So I think that if you can see that some of these are political tools, then fine, and then we move on from there. But it's a good base for sure. Nothing wrong with an A minus.
Yeah, he does get criticism from the far left in, you know, working with Kathy Hochul, keeping Commissioner Tish on, but also recently doing like a photo op with former President Obama, right?
Well, okay, yeah, briefly, before we conclude then, last thing, what do you think about the criticism from the left and then him appearing with Obama on stage?
I don't see it as a bad thing. I think what he's doing there is trying to pull that Overton window more to the left, as it has slowly creeped ever and ever to the right, as we've talked about before. Because it's not Mamdani giving Obama, you know, a platform. He's Obama. So he already has he's the one platforming Mamdani in a way. But I think mainstream Democrats appearing alongside Mamdani does more to normalize socialism than it does express that Mamdani is moving to the center. Do you agree with that?
Maybe. Well, it depends on whether Mamdani can stay as progressive as he is.
Yeah.
And I think part of their aim is to bring him more to the center. But if he can hold fast, then yes, it will have that effect. Maybe eventually a major left-wing party will realize that people want progressive policies and actually change their policies to be progressive rather than trying to win votes from the right by moving ever further right. We can live in hope. But I will sit with a resigned hope until that time.
Well, I think that's fair. And I don't know what you're planning to close with, but I wanted to play something for you that's 45 seconds long, if that's all right.
Sure, yeah.
And the context for this is that this is after his 100 days has passed. This is yesterday. And basically a video went viral from a woman in her apartment, and her elevator had been broken for months. And she was carrying a pram, a stroller, up the stairs every day for these months. This video came out the day before. So 2 days ago, that video went viral. It said, "Mayor, please help me. My building's elevator is broken." Something to that effect. And I think this response from him in a speech the next day goes to show, kind of summarizes Mamdani in a nutshell, in that this is a good photo op. It's a good opportunity for OW, but also it shows that his ear is to the ground and that he is listening.
Her elevator was down for 5 months. And sometimes when you hear these things, you think of them only in numbers and statistics. You lose sight of what this actually means. So she took out her phone and she showed me a video. A video of one of her neighbors who has a daughter that's disabled. A daughter who needs to use that elevator every single day. And she showed me a video of this woman carrying her daughter up these flights of stairs, from the school bus to the apartment building and then up the flights. This is what the toll looks like when we do not have a city where every single tenant understands that safe and habitable housing is their right.
I think that encapsulates all of what we've talked about pretty well, right? It's like I said, the easy W, but also is showing that he is listening. And what do you think about that?
I think that's right. Let's hope that his mayorship continues in that vein.
Yeah. Hopefully by if we do a year and check in, it's in this positive sense of, okay, he's done this, rather than he went back on these promises, or he went more center, right? And we still got to keep holding him accountable.
For sure. Let's encourage our New York comrades to keep him accountable and check in again at the 1 year mark.
And I think the reason that we have this fascination with Mamdani is he is the only use case we have of our ideology in motion in the West, right? At the moment.
Certainly the most high profile. Yeah, certainly most high profile. And so it's definitely something we want to keep an eye on. And we shall. We'll leave it there for now. We'll finish off with a quote from Dorothy Parker, which you can read in a moment, Sam. Until then, thank you, Sam, for podding with me. Thank you, dear listener, for listening. Stay safe, look after each other, and keep fighting the good fight.
London is satisfied. Paris is resigned. But New York is always hopeful. Always it believes that something good is about to come off, and it must hurry to meet it.